Hi folks, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Today I'm going to be running through how to write a good college history paper. Now, some of you have emailed me with some concerns about how to do this properly, so I figured I'd run through some basics in a short tutorial for you, but in particular things to avoid in college writing generally. Now, some of you are much more experienced writers. This is really probably going to be review. It's not mandatory, but hopefully it will be helpful to the majority of you as you begin to work on that first paper. So I'll talk about some basic mistakes, basic ideas for structuring and generating theses, as well as giving you some examples. I've actually got paragraphs that I've borrowed from essays that have been turned into me before to show you some good and some bad and some very ugly in college writing. Okay, so you're sitting down at your computer, you're ready to write, you've read the book that you're going to review. Where do you start? You start by trying to find yourself a thesis. A thesis is an argument. In most college writing, especially short essays like you will be doing for me this semester, you're going to want a single sentence somewhere in your first paragraph that makes an argument. Now, what does this thesis look like? Well, the best way to describe it is that it answers a question worth answering, based on whatever subject you're analyzing. In other words, in these essays, you should not be restating the history to me. You should not be re-describing the entire narrative of the book. That's not college-level writing. That may be what you do in high school in some places, but not in college. The goal with these papers instead is to provide your own critique or analysis. Now, in generating that thesis, the best way to do it is to come up with an interesting question. Like I said, something that's worth answering. How can you tell if it's interesting or not to your reader or to me? Well, try to think if anyone would find it controversial. Would people disagree with it? If the answer is yes, if there is some contention, you could get some back and forth going, then great. Because the point of your essay, your entire paper, is to convince. It is to make an argument and to convince your reader that your argument is logically sound. That's the goal of a paper. So keep that in mind as you begin to write. So the next logical question is, how do I generate an argument worth writing about? Where do I get my thesis? So as you probably heard a million times in high school, the process by which you generate an argument worth writing about, the thesis, is brainstorming. So how do you brainstorm properly? I have a couple of recommendations for you. First things first, talk through with yourself or with somebody else whatever material you want to write about. If it's your book, think through to yourself what kind of connections you see, what kind of similarities and dissimilarities you see between the characters, the themes, the author's intent. The goal is to try to make a sort of mental map of whatever important markers you see in the work you're looking at. You can draw this out on paper. Some people find that helpful. But try to find these connections in whatever material you're reviewing. It often is helpful to actually talk it out with somebody else. Now, a good thesis is going to answer a question, which means that before you get a thesis, you need to have a question. Once you start looking at that mental map, or start having that conversation about the material you've looked at, try to generate some interesting questions. Why does the author say this? What are the author's politics? What does he mean here? If you want to look at the author, what does this character symbolize? Or, for instance, what does this character represent in Russian society? What is the historical moment that becomes apparent in literature? Are there any major political figures that are subtly attacked in the writing? These are the sort of things you're going to want to do in a historical examination of literature, as we're doing with our first paper. Okay, so you've generated some interesting questions, and hopefully you have a couple of interesting sentences in response to those questions now. How do you decide which one to make your thesis? Well, you want to have a sentence, of course, that is interesting and makes an argument, that draws your reader in, some sort of hook. The reader needs to be convinced fairly quickly that the essay is worth their time. Now, of course, in this case, I'm your reader, so I'm going to read it no matter what. But still, try to make it relevant and interesting and in some way controversial, not instantly obvious. So that's one criterion. 2, you want to find a thesis that will help you write the paper of the right length. So, for instance, if you want to make an examination of the author's intent, it might be too narrow to, for instance, try to examine, well, Tolstoy's index finger when he was handwriting War and Peace had the following impact. That's a very narrow thesis, not very interesting either, maybe not a great example. But you want to find something that's not too narrow, too small to write 5 pages about. At the same time, you don't want something too big. Tolstoy's vision of history as portrayed in Anna Karenina, War and Peace, the Cossacks, etc., is blah, blah, blah. That would be much too large for the sort of paper you're doing here. So you want to find something that's going to generate enough material for 5 pages, but not be unanswerable in those same 5 pages. So keep that in mind too. So once you've gone through this winnowing process, hopefully you have a really good sentence to start you out with. The next step is drawing evidence from your source material, in this case the literature, but with our second paper from primary sources, from your textbook, from other historians, and turning it into a paper. The structure of your paper is going to vary depending on how you're arguing for your thesis. So I'm not going to give you super specific suggestions. Here are 3 probably pretty obvious things that you should think about when structuring your paper. That thesis needs to show up at the beginning. Your reader needs to know what you're arguing and be interested enough in that argument to continue reading the paper. I would suggest you start by putting your thesis up at the top and fleshing out your introduction only once you're done, once you're certain of what you're actually going to be arguing. 2, supporting paragraphs, each of which reflects, supports, and confirms the thesis statement. To begin, you want to have some sort of skeleton. Your thesis at the top, and then you want to think of different supports for that particular thesis. I'm not saying you have to do the high school thing and have 3 supports, each of which are equally weighted and same length. In college, you should be beyond that. You don't have to do that. But make sure that each supporting paragraph reflects, supports, and confirms the thesis statement. In addition, a good paper will heavily draw evidence from whatever it is that's being examined. In our example in the literature, you should be quoting and drawing as much material as possible from the book, novel, or short story itself. Finally, and naturally enough, you should have some sort of concluding paragraph. The idea here is to restate the importance of what you've just been arguing for 5 or 6 pages to your reader, and perhaps highlight something new about your analysis. Show why your analysis is unique or interesting in a way that you haven't mentioned before to your reader. You don't want to end your essay too abruptly. Alright, so let's discuss some major issues that might appear in your writing. These are 3 of the 4 most common mistakes that I see in college writing. The sentence fragment. This is where a subordinate clause gets separated somehow from a main clause. As a result, we see an awkward construction that doesn't fit grammatically. Run-on sentences. This is where you have too many clauses in a sentence. If you have more than 2 or 3 ands in a sentence, there's a fairly good bet that you've written a run-on sentence. I have seen some remarkably long sentences. I'm talking 12, 13, 14 lines, which certainly should not appear in the English language. Apostrophes. This is very simple. I'm not going to review it. Look online. The other annoyingly frequent mistake that I see revolves around tense consistency. Usually when writing a history paper, you're going to want to write the entire paper in the past tense. That is, your verbs will all appear in the past tense. You need to pick a tense and stick with it. The big mistake that so many students make is switching sentence to sentence, or even within sentences between past and present tenses. Tense consistency is a big grammatical issue, and you should keep an eye out for it in your own papers. In addition, I often see issues with pronoun agreement. If you can't see the mistake in this sentence, make sure you review your grammar. Also, there, were. Spell checkers don't pick that up, so I often see even good students mixing those up. Just double check all of these things. If you're concerned about your knowledge of English grammar, this is the best book to go to, Strunk and White. Not only does it have every bit of grammatical advice you can imagine, but a lot of very good stylistic advice as well. Alright, so let's look at some examples of good and bad college essays here in a segment I like to call The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Great movie. If you haven't seen it, see it. Alright, so let's look at this. As I read some sections of this, I want you to think, is this good, bad, or really bad? World communism is like malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. Communism can't really get a foothold when things are going well for a nation. Alright, what are some problems with these first two sentences of this introductory paragraph? One, we have a quote to start things off that is really, it's not embedded at all in the text. In addition, the author actually miswrote the quote. Is like malignant parasite is actually a misquote of the text he was trying to quote. In addition, he failed to footnote correctly. As you can see at the end here, he used an asterisk, not a footnote. We'll talk about footnoting in a second. This was a bad start, and it didn't get much better. Communism can't really get a foothold when things are going well for a nation. It actually gets a little bit worse here in the second sentence. Communism can't really get a foothold when things are going well for a nation. What's the problem with this thesis sentence? Well, first we have a contraction, which is really not something that is appropriate in academic writing. You should not have contractions in your essays, ladies and gentlemen. In addition, the use of the phrase can't really get a foothold. This is what is referred to as a colloquialism. That is something you might say in conversation, but again is not something that belongs in formal writing. The thesis itself, communism can't really get a foothold when things are going well for a nation, actually is not a bad thesis if expressed properly. What could the author have said instead? Social instability in Russia was the major cause of Bolshevik success in the Russian Revolution. That's a thesis, and that's really what he's trying to say here. If at first you can't get a beautifully crafted sentence, keep rephrasing it until it sounds better. Alright, here's another example. There was a lot of rebel-rousing from these guys, especially the radical left communists. So there was a diffuse of political ideology which really didn't represent anyone, but mostly used victims such as the working class who were worked like slave labor, and the serfs and the peasants to achieve their, misspelled, political means. If you go down the next paragraph here, the monarchy's ability to govern is compromised from these and other events, and a revolution sparked in 1905 due to the shooting of 130 men, women, and children on Bloody Sunday. Okay, so what are some problems? Well, we've got the tense inconsistency. We've got past tense in that paragraph, present in the paragraph below. The author actually went back to the past then in the next paragraph. Not ideal. We've got about half a dozen misspellings. There's a missed apostrophe, not that the contraction should be there in the first place. A lot of extra words that can be cut out. And in addition, we see some, again, real colloquial writing from these guys is really not appropriate in writing. Now, it sounds a little bit ridiculous when I read some of these sentences, but a lot of these papers were written by smart people who I'm fairly convinced, having talked to in office hours, wrote these papers at the last minute. Now, the way to avoid a lot of these mistakes is to read through your paper aloud. Now, it sounds a little silly, but I promise you, you will catch so many mistakes if you read the paper out loud to yourself. All right, we've got some more interesting mistakes here. Without international funding, then Endeavor would have failed. Not just the revolution, but the whole communist government, considering all the factories built at this time were constructed under American supervision as well as setup and training. Attempts to do it on their own were dismal failures, having stupidly killed everyone who knew what they were doing out of sheer envy and spite. Okay, so what are the issues here? Well, again, we've got some spelling mistakes. You would be shocked how many of these I see. In addition, we've got a sentence fragment. That second sentence is not a complete sentence, an independent clause. Finally, we have editorializing. Now, you are trying to make an argument in your thesis, but saying that they stupidly killed someone, editorializing in that way about the historical actors that you're discussing, is something that you should generally avoid. It makes your paper look amateurish, frankly. You can convince your audience, if that's the point of your essay, that the actions of so-and-so, in this case Lenin and the Bolsheviks, were poorly planned, poorly executed, poorly whatever. But you just simply throwing in adverbs or adjectives like this, making good guys and bad guys in your story, is not something you want to do in historical writing, in academic history. Make an argument if you want, but don't simply just throw those sort of things out there. Alright, so now let's talk about some examples of good writing. This example is from one of my favorite student essays that I've had the privilege to grade while I've been teaching here at Ohio State. So this is the introductory paragraph, the top half here. Let me read to you what the thesis is. One of the most unexpectedly influential factors of the revolution, stemmed from the widespread education of the lower class. So that's the thesis. Now let's think about that for a second. It's unexpected. How would increasing literacy rates contribute to the possible success of the violent overthrow of the government? It's not something that's immediately apparent, which is something you should be looking for with your theses. He then clearly presents his map for the rest of the essay. The Bolshevik Revolution earned its success through the combined literacy of the proletariat and the leadership of Lenin, and in doing so incorporated aspects of Russian past alongside new, radically different ideals. In framing his essay this way, he combines both the conventional historical approach about the importance of Lenin with his own thesis about the literacy of the proletariat. Now, he doesn't provide here his three supports for this thesis, which he will do later in the essay. That's something that I would recommend a lot of you do, again, if you're a little uncertain about your own standard of writing. But picking a thesis like this and suggesting to your audience its importance is a really great way to start off. Let's change gears for a second and talk about footnotes. This is one thing college students struggle with. Footnotes are a way of indicating intellectual property rights. You're going to need them in a professional life if you're in business, law, medicine. They show up a lot, so let's learn how to do it right. In Microsoft Word, you'll click References, Insert Footnote, and then you'll get this at the bottom of your screen. What do you write there? Well, you'll write the author, the title, and in parentheses, the city of publication, publishing house, date of publication, etc. This guide is actually up on Carmen for you. I've got some additional references, including how to cite one of the video lectures if you choose to do so. So when do you use a footnote? Maybe I should have mentioned that the footnote goes at the end of the sentence that contains the intellectual property of someone else. There are four main times to cite. Anytime anything is in quotation marks, because you're actually quoting from something, if you're actually showing text or language from somebody else, gotta have a footnote. If you're paraphrasing, that is, borrowing ideas from somebody else, you need to use a footnote. If you're summarizing, footnote. And if you're citing any specific facts, figures, or data, footnote. Now, if you do any of these things and don't use a footnote, it's technically plagiarism. And if you do it a lot, you can get in trouble. Big trouble. So when in doubt, always cite. In addition, please don't write your footnotes in crayon. Please don't write them upside down. Please don't write them in a foreign language. Should be simple enough, but I've seen all three. Let's conclude with some general suggestions. Read your essay out loud. I mentioned that before. You can catch a lot of mistakes that way. In addition, stylistic advice. Never use a long Latin word when a short German one will do. English has a lot of Latin-based words and a lot of German-based words. The German ones tend to be shorter and more concise. We've got this example from Latin, hippopotamonstros equipedalian. That word literally means long words in Latin. Don't try to impress me with your vocabulary. It doesn't necessarily improve your writing at all. What you want to do is have short, clear sentences that get your point across. Intelligent writing often requires using a lot of short words rather than a lot of big ones. Keep that in mind. In addition, use simple sentence constructions. Do not have a 500-word sentence. I may actually die reading that if you turn an essay in like that. Short sentences, simple sentences. It's about the ideas more than trying to impress with complex constructions. Let someone else look it over. Simple, you need to get it done a little bit earlier, but it can usually improve your writing at least a third of a letter grade, letting someone else take a look at it. That can include me. I am happy to look at drafts of your writing, but having a fresh set of eyes on your essay can really make a big difference. And to that point also, if you can get your essay done a few days early, set it down and not look at it, and come back and finish editing, you will catch a number of mistakes, you'll catch contradictions, you'll catch things that don't make sense that you wouldn't do, that you wouldn't have caught if you did all your editing at the last minute. Really can make a big difference. So now we've covered the basics of writing a college-level history paper. You have no excuse to write anything other than a beautifully crafted, A+, perfect paper, right? You should have everything under control. Well, don't worry. It doesn't have to be perfect, especially this first essay. The idea of this class is to help you improve your writing, in part. Two further suggestions for getting help. One is the Writing Center on campus. They're very helpful. You can set up a meeting, run through grammar with them. They may not be as familiar with the Russian content, but they can help you formulate a thesis and structure, etc. It can be very helpful. And finally, I am happy to look at drafts as you go along. I'm happy to give suggestions to help you formulate things. I would rather see a not-so-great draft and help you fix it up than a not-so-great final essay. That's what I'm here for. So, I'll see you with the next lecture. I hope this is helpful, and good luck on your papers.